Welcome back to CRYPTID'S Den. It truly means a lot to have you here. I hope today's been kind to you, and if not, maybe this little corner of the internet can bring a bit of light your way. Let me know where you're watching from. It's always a joy to connect. If you haven't yet, take a second to subscribe and share your thoughts below. Your voice adds so much to this community. Now, let's get into it. Have you ever imagined being left alone in the dead of winter? No food, no electricity, no voice but your own. And then hearing footsteps that don't belong to any human? I was 9 when my father took me to an old cabin by a frozen lake. Said it was a hunting trip. Said he'd be back before dark. He never came back. At first I thought it was a test. A be a man kind of thing. But then, the food ran out, the shadows outside started moving, and the things that came, they weren't animals. They weren't human. They watched, laughed, whispered through the cracks in the wood. I should have been dead. But something else found me first. My name is Richard, and I survived 8 nights alone in the snow. Not because I was strong, but because they chose me. In this video, I'll tell you the truth I've never spoken aloud. What I saw, what saved me, and why, if you ever wake up with a symbol drawn in snow on your forehead, you might be next. My name's Eli Harper. I was 9 the winter my father left me at the old cabin by Sand Ridge Lake. He said it was just a day trip. Said he needed to handle some things in town. I remember the sound of gravel under his tires, the red tail lights disappearing between the trees, and the way the wind moved in the silence after. He told me he'd be back before dark. But darkness came. He didn't. The cabin wasn't much. 1 room, no electricity, a wood stove that coughed more smoke than heat, and windows that let in more cold than light. He'd left me with a sleeping bag, a half-used box of matches, and a grocery sack with some beef jerky cheese sticks, 3 chocolate chip cookies, and a single can of Dr. Pepper. That was it. No coat heavy enough for the kind of cold that crawled through the Mississippi pines in December. Just me, the lake, and whatever else lived out there. The first few hours, I tried pretending it was an adventure, like I was some wilderness scout, testing my skills. I drew silly maps in my notebook and stacked firewood like I had seen on TV, but by the time the shadows started crawling up the trees, I couldn't pretend anymore. My hands were shaking too hard to light a match, and my breath came out like smoke in the air. The Dr. Pepper froze halfway through drinking it. I sat on the cabin floor, curled in the sleeping bag, and tried not to cry. I told myself it was just a day. Just one day. I tried to listen to the forest, to its rhythm, its language, but it wasn't speaking like it usually did. It felt like it was holding its breath. Even the birds were gone. That's when I first heard it. A branch snapping, not far, maybe 20 feet out. I froze, every part of me pulled tight like fishing line. Then, nothing. Silence. Not the good kind, not the safe kind. The kind that makes your ears ring. I stood up slowly and crept to the window. The glass was foggy, cracked at the edges. I wiped it with my sleeve. There, between 2 pine trunks, something was standing, still as a post, tall, too tall. No coat, no hat, just dark, hunched, motionless. I blinked, and it wasn't there anymore. I backed away from the window and pressed my back to the wall. I could hear the wind again, but it sounded wrong, like it was curling around something out there, like it was bending around a shape I couldn't see. I grabbed the fire poker, not because I thought it'd help, but because my hands needed something. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the poker close and stared at the door, daring it to stay closed. The morning didn't bring warmth, just pale light through thin clouds, and the sound of frost cracking beneath the window ledge. My father still hadn't come. I waited another hour. Then, another. My stomach turned on itself, twisting with hunger and something worse. Not fear. Something deeper. Like I was disappearing, cell by cell. I walked to the edge of the lake. The surface was glassy, rimmed with thin ice. Trees stood like guards around the water, their arms tangled in gray clouds. I saw no tire marks, no footprints. Not his. But I did see something. In the snow, just a few steps from the cabin door, was a print. Not a boot. Bigger, wider. 3 distinct toes, deep set, like it belonged to something heavier than a man. There was only one, no matching prints around it. Just that single track, as if the thing had landed there. Or stepped from somewhere else. I spent the afternoon checking the same spot again and again, but it never made sense. The snow around it was untouched. No drag marks. No trail leading in or out. Just that one impression, staring up at me like an eye. Later, I tried the radio from my father's truck, but he'd taken the keys. I screamed until my throat burned, but the forest didn't echo me back. I went back inside, locked the door, sat by the window. The sun dropped like a stone behind the trees. That's when the knocking started. At first, I thought it was wind, something scraping the roof, or maybe a loose shutter. But then it came again. Not on the wall. On the roof. 3 knocks. Pause. Then 3 again. Not hard. Like someone knocking on a front door, polite and patient. I held my breath, moved slow, the poker gripped in both hands. I didn't go outside. I didn't look up. I just waited. And then it stopped. I sat there, too afraid to blink, too alert to breathe. After a while, I told myself I'd imagined it. That I was cold and tired and starting to slip. I almost believed that, until I turned and saw what had been left on the windowsill. Not a rock, not a pine cone. Something else, something like a feather, but thicker, coarser, black as soot. 4 inches long, one end frayed like it had been pulled from flesh. I didn't touch it, just stared. The wind rose again, sharp and full of teeth. I think that's when I stopped waiting for my father to come back. The cold had a different weight that morning. Not sharper, just heavier, like it had settled deeper into everything. Into the walls, into the air, into me. I sat by the stove, watching the last flame flicker out beneath blackened logs. The wood was nearly gone. I had 3 matches left. My father still hadn't returned. I no longer believed he would. The feather was still on the windowsill. Unmoved, untouched. Except now there were tiny ice crystals clinging to its edges, like even the frost wasn't sure it wanted to claim it. I kept glancing at it without meaning to. It had no business being there, not in the way it had appeared. It was too intentional, like it had been placed. Outside, the snow had turned crunchy, the top layer hardened by wind. I wrapped myself in the thin blanket from the cot and stepped onto the porch. The sky was pale but heavy with clouds, the kind that refused to let the sun through. I scanned the tree line. Still. The lake, half frozen now, looked flat and empty, but the forest didn't feel empty. I walked along the edge of the cabin, keeping close to the wall. That's when I saw them. Tracks. Not boot prints, not animal either. 2 wide, the toes. 3 of them. Almost human-shaped, but broader, thicker. Like something walked barefoot through the snow with feet meant for gripping dirt, not frost. They circled halfway around the cabin and then stopped. Just stopped. No continuation, no turn back. Like the thing had appeared from nowhere and left the same way. I followed the prints out toward the lake, where they vanished at the edge of the ice. My own breath sounded loud, too loud, and I could hear the blood pushing through my ears. There was no crack in the ice, no break. Just more snow, the kind that hides things too easily. I turned back toward the cabin and felt something shift, not in the trees, not in the air, but in me. A pressure at the back of my neck, the sensation you get when you know you're not alone. but there's no one to see. I moved faster, not quite running. Not yet. The door creaked louder than I remembered as I pushed it closed behind me. I slid the bolt and stepped back. The room felt colder than before, like something had slipped in through the cracks while I was gone. I sat against the wall and stared at the door, then at the feather, then back to the door. Nothing moved, nothing changed. Sometime near late afternoon, the wind picked up again. It scraped at the windows and rattled something loose on the roof. I heard a soft tap, then another, a third. It didn't stop this time. It grew faster, lighter, like fingers or claws, drumming on wood. I covered my ears and pressed my knees to my chest. The drumming moved, left to right, back to front, until it was over my head, tracing lines I couldn't see. Then it stopped, all at once, like a breath sucked in and never let out. I didn't realize I'd fallen asleep until the cold woke me. Dusk had crept into the room. The fire was long dead. The air was thick and unmoving. I couldn't hear the wind anymore. Not even the creak of the roof. Just silence. And beneath that silence, something worse. Something worse. Something listening. I sat up slowly, heart thudding in my throat. A sound, faint, almost not real. The scrape of snow beneath shifting weight. Not one set of feet, more. 2, 3, maybe 4. I crawled to the window and peeked through the bottom edge of the curtain. Shadows. Low to the ground, darting between trees. They didn't walk like people. They moved like they knew the snow, like they'd lived in it longer than I'd been alive. Quick, sharp, intentional. And then one of them stood. It rose from the brush on 2 legs, taller than the others. Shoulders hunched, arms long, swaying slightly, like it was tasting the air. The shape of it, wrong. Not a bear, not a man. Something in between and neither. It turned toward the cabin. I let the curtain fall. I backed away from the window, slow, careful, like movement alone might call attention. I crouched behind the cot and held the poker again. Useless as it was, it made me feel like I had something. Minutes passed, nothing. Then, a knock. Not on the roof this time, the wall. Just beside the window, 3 knocks, like before. Then silence. Then another set, lower this time. Another wall. They were circling me, playing a game, testing. I covered my mouth with both hands to stop from breathing too loudly. My fingers trembled. Something brushed the door. Not hit, brushed, like a fingertip across the wood. Then a soft, high sound. Laughter. Thin, unhuman, like someone imitating a child's voice and getting it almost right. Almost. I don't remember falling asleep again. But I woke in the early dark to the sound of nothing. No knocks. No wind. Just stillness. The kind that wraps around your chest and makes it hard to breathe. I got up, legs stiff, and walked to the window. I didn't want to look, but I did. On the ground, where the snow met the porch, were more tracks. Not from before. New. A trail now, leading from the woods to the steps, then gone. But that wasn't the worst part. On the windowsill, just beneath the feather, was a second one, shorter. Red at the tip. That night, I didn't try to keep the fire going. I sat in the dark, knees to chest, listening to a silence that had stopped pretending to be empty. And I began to think, maybe they weren't waiting for me to leave. Maybe they were waiting for me to understand why I couldn't. They didn't come at once. That would have made sense, would have followed some pattern my brain could latch onto. But they came in fragments. Shadows first. Sounds next. Then shapes that didn't hold still long enough for me to name them. It started just after the moon dipped behind the clouds. The kind of darkness you don't measure with your eyes, but feel crawling along the back of your teeth. I had been dozing, not sleeping, curled tight beneath the cot, my knees bruised from 2 nights on floorboards that breathed cold up through the cracks. I don't know what woke me, not exactly. Just a sense of movement in the dark. A shift in the room that didn't belong to me. The window, left side, rattled once, a single brief shake. Not the wind. The wind didn't knock in rhythm. I lifted my head and waited. Nothing. Then a scrape. Not fingernails, not claws, something dragging softly across the glass. I crawled out from under the cot, slow as I could, careful not to make the boards groan. I crouched near the stove and gripped the poker tighter, though the weight of it no longer felt like protection, just an echo of it. The scrape came again, then a sound I couldn't place, a huff, breathy, but not quite breath, like a laugh that didn't understand joy. I moved to the window on the far side, the one with the corner crack. I didn't pull the curtain back. I just leaned in, barely parting the fabric, enough for one eye. There was something crouched just beyond the porch, bent low, knees forward, arms long, too long. Its head was tilted like it was listening, but the eyes were already on me. 2 pinpricks of pale orange, glowing just enough to be wrong. It didn't blink. It didn't move. But I swear it knew. I stumbled backward, hit the edge of the stove, and dropped the poker. A second shape darted past the window from the right. Not a run, more like a twitch, a blur. Then another passed, opposite side. I counted 3, maybe more. I'd lost track. The sound came again. Not from outside, from the roof, scurrying. Then a thud. Something heavier landed. Something that didn't bother being quiet. It stomped. Deliberate. Just once. I backed into the far corner of the room, beside the cupboard where the food bag had once been. The feather still sat on the sill, untouched. Now joined by the red-tipped one from the night before. Their placement felt purposeful, like offerings or warnings. I didn't want to know which. The knock on the door came soft. Too soft for the size of the things I'd seen. It was mocking, like it had watched me enough to understand how we behaved. A pause. Then a second knock. Then nothing. I held my breath and listened. I could hear them, shuffling around the outside, not stomping, not running, not even sneaking, just existing with full intent. One of them passed by the far window. I saw it more clearly this time, thinner than the one by the porch. Shoulders narrow, hips awkward, like its limbs were pulled from different bones. It turned and smiled. The mouth was too wide, too shallow, a smile that had never practiced. Then, from somewhere near the back wall, a voice. Not outside, not inside, not quite sound at all, whispered something I couldn't fully understand. Not words, but I knew the meaning anyway. A suggestion, a challenge, or maybe an invitation. Come out. The cabin creaked under the weight of something shifting against it. Then came a low groan of wood. They were leaning, testing. I pressed both hands against my ears. The air itself began to buzz, like static right under my skin. One of them laughed, or tried to. It came out wrong, like someone had broken a wind-up toy and let it spin itself to pieces. I darted to the cot and crawled beneath it again, pulling the sleeping bag over me like a barrier. My breath was loud, too loud. I tried to slow it down, but couldn't. Every exhale felt like an invitation to be heard, found, touched. My heart hurt from how hard it thumped. Not fast, just heavy, like it had become too much for my chest. Above me, I heard the latch click. Not open, just shift. I froze. The door never opened, but it wanted to. Something scraped the wood. Then came the slow dragging of fingers across the front, right at head level. They were still outside, for now. I stayed under the cot until my muscles went numb, and my skin stopped telling me if it was hot or cold. Hours must have passed, but I couldn't be sure. When I finally crawled out, dawn hadn't arrived, but a faint gray pressed against the windows. I forced myself to stand, legs shaking, and went to the door. It was still shut, still latched. but something had been left in front of it. Not a feather this time. A stone. Round, smooth, darker than anything else around, and warm. I didn't pick it up. Not yet. Because across the snow, right where the prints had ended the day before, I saw them again, 3 figures, standing side by side at the tree line, motionless, watching. They hadn't come to drag me out. They'd come to see if I would come willingly. And something inside me, something I didn't understand yet, leaned toward yes. I don't know what pushed me out the door that morning. Maybe it was the stillness. The kind that presses so hard on your chest, you have to move just to feel like you still exist. Maybe it was something older. Something already inside me that wanted to know what was waiting beyond the edge of fear. Either way, I stepped out barefoot into snow that cracked like old bones and burned worse than fire. The 3 shapes at the tree line didn't move. They watched. Not like animals, not like people. Like judges. One of them took a step forward, not fast, just firm. And that's when the others followed, not toward me, but around. A slow, deliberate circle that never broke eye contact. I didn't run. I don't think I could have if I tried. I just stood there, shaking from something colder than the wind. Then the air shifted. Not temperature, pressure. The ground gave the slightest rumble under my heels, like something vast had shifted below it. The trees groaned. I turned, slowly, toward the sound, and for a moment I thought it was just a trick of the storm. But then the lake answered. A deep vibration rolled out across the frozen surface. Subtle at first, then growing louder, heavier, until the crusted snow shuddered and the ice beneath it cracked like splitting glass. I stumbled back, heart pounding in my throat. The 3 shapes froze. Their heads snapped toward the woods behind me, in perfect sync. Not fear, submission. That's when I heard it. A low howl. Not wolf. Not wind. Something much bigger. It rolled over the trees, bending branches, shaking loose drifts of snow from the canopy. My knees buckled. I dropped to the ground and covered my ears, but it was already inside me. Not just sound. A presence. Something waking. When I opened my eyes, they were gone. The 3 smaller ones. No sign. No prints. Like they'd been swept away by the sound. But I wasn't alone. I knew that even before I looked up. I didn't hear footsteps. I felt them. The weight, the rhythm, the power of it. Each one landed like thunder wrapped in earth. My bones knew before my eyes did. And when I looked, they were already there. 3 of them. Not like the others. Built not for speed or mischief, but for command. One step forward, the snow splitting around its feet, steam rising from its shoulders, where the air touched its heat. Its eyes weren't glowing. They didn't have to. They held something else. Something old. I couldn't move. My body didn't register anything beyond survival. But I wasn't scared the way I had been. This wasn't the same. The fear that came with the smaller ones was sharp, chaotic. This was quiet, reverent. My breath slowed. My heart, still loud, began to steady. The one in front lowered itself, not crouched, not aggressive, just slow and intentional, as if making itself smaller so I didn't have to. It didn't reach out. It didn't speak, but I heard it all the same, not in words, in memory. Emotion, a feeling like warm bark under sunlight, like roots growing slow and deep, like something that remembered being something else. Behind it, the others watched, guarded, calm. Not blinking, not judging, just waiting. The first one tilted its head, and that's when I understood. They hadn't come for the ones before me. They'd come for me. And I was meant to decide what happened next. But the silence didn't last. Behind us, trees cracked, sharp and frantic. The kind of sound that comes from something desperate and wrong. The air snapped cold again. The first figure turned. I followed its gaze and saw them. The three from before. Scrambling, breathless, no longer taunting, no longer laughing. Afraid, they burst from the underbrush in a blind rush, scattering snow. Limbs jerking wild, eyes wide with something beyond panic. They hadn't just been chased. They'd been hunted. The ground trembled again, not from the giants, from whatever came next. Then something cracked through the forest. A howl shriller than before, closer and layered with something broken. The smaller ones screamed. Not roars, not growls. Screams. The kind that doesn't come from mouths but from memory. They lunged toward me. All three. Wild, clawing. Like if they could get to me, they could make it stop. One tackled me from the left, slamming my ribs hard enough to knock breath from my lungs. Another grabbed my ankle, dragging me toward the tree line. I kicked, flailed, but their hands were too strong, too fast. I felt claws bite through my pants, scraping skin. The world twisted. My head hit snow. Light burst behind my eyes. I screamed. I think. I don't know. And then it all went still. Not slowly. Instantly. The hands let go. The shrieks cut short. I blinked through tears and saw it. One of the smaller ones thrown backward like a doll, landing with a thud that sent up a spray of powder. Another pinned beneath one of the giants. Not crushed, not torn, but held still by a hand large enough to cover its chest and back at once. The third trembled at my feet, whimpering like a child, then vanished into the brush. The one who'd knelt beside me before was now standing, still as a stone. It looked down at me. I didn't move. Couldn't. But I felt something settle inside me. Something quiet and dark and slow. The giant stepped closer, lowered its hand, palm open. Not a demand, not a threat. An invitation. I reached out, blood streaked across my knuckles, and placed my hand against its skin. It was warm, softer than it should been, alive. And in that moment, the snow stopped falling. The wind stilled. The forest waited. And so did I. It held my hand for longer than it needed to. Not tight. Just enough to make sure I knew it was real. I couldn't stop staring at the way its fingers folded around mine. Thick, covered in coarse, dark hair. But the skin beneath was warm. The kind of warmth that reached past the surface and into the bone. My own hand looked like a doll's in comparison. Bruised. Bloody. But not trembling anymore. Not after that touch. The other two stepped in behind it, forming a loose triangle around me. Not closing in. Not surrounding, just being near like a shield without walls. I could feel their presence pressing out against the woods, like they were holding something larger at bay. Or maybe reminding the trees what lived older than them. The one in front of me, Thorn, though I didn't know his name then, let go of my hand and turned. He didn't look back to check if I'd follow. He didn't need to. My legs moved before I could decide. Pushing through snow that came up past my ankles, past the edge of pain, until the cold felt like part of my body. We walked into the forest, deeper than I'd ever dared. Branches closed overhead, thick with frost, muffling the world until all I could hear was the snow beneath our steps and the quiet hum of breath. Mine ragged, theirs steady. The further we went, the less the forest looked like anything I recognized. No boot prints, no human scars. Just tall trunks leaning at odd angles, roots twisting across the ground like veins, moss glowing faintly green even in the dim. They moved like they belonged to it, like they remembered when the forest had a different name, one that no human mouth could shape. Every so often, Thorn would pause, his head tilting toward a sound only he could hear, and the others would do the same, still a stone until the moment passed. Then we moved again. After what felt like hours, the trees opened into a clearing, not wide, just enough space for the sky to press through. And in the center of that space, sunk low into the earth, was a hollow tree wider than any I'd ever seen. It rose like a tower but split at base, hollowed from within. Its bark burned and blackened around the entrance, a place something else might have run from. But they stepped toward it with a silence that felt sacred. Inside, it was warmer, not from fire. The air itself held a kind of heat, like it remembered the sun. I followed them in, ducking low, and stood in the middle of the space while they spread out along the edges. I could smell ash and soil, the faint sweetness of dried berries, and something else I couldn't name. In the center of the hollow was a shallow indentation in the floor, and inside it, a pile of coal still faintly glowing. No flames, just the pulse of slow-burning embers that gave off no smoke. Thorn knelt beside it, not praying, listening. Then he reached into something slung over his shoulder, a pouch made of hide, stitched with what looked like dried grass and fine bone. From it, he pulled a string of bark-wrapped cord and tied to it. Hanging loose at the center was a shard of stone no bigger than my thumb. Pale green, smooth at the edges, and glowing from within. Not bright, just enough to be alive. He didn't say anything. He just held it out to me. I took it. The moment it touched my skin, something bloomed in my chest. Not heat, not cold, just awareness. A deep sense that I was being seen, not just looked at, but understood from the inside out. The shard vibrated once, and then, quietly, I heard her voice. Not fully, not like words in the air, just the echo of her, the memory of my mother. Humming by the stove, folding my shirts, touching the back of my head when she passed. It wrapped around me like a sound you only feel when it's gone. I wanted to hold it tighter, but my hand wouldn't move. The third figure stepped forward now. Oren smaller than the others. His eyes softer, mouth just barely open like he might speak but chose not to. He pointed to the shard, then to my chest. Then he pressed his palm to his own heart. I nodded, not knowing why. He touched the top of my head with one finger, then stepped back. I stood there a long time, the stone pulsing faintly in my hand. I thought I'd cry, but I didn't. There was no panic left. Only a kind of weightless exhaustion, like I'd been emptied out and filled again with something quieter. I slid the cord over my head. The shard settled just below my throat. It felt heavier than it looked. They led me out without a word. Back through the tunnel of leaning trees, back across the snow. The world hadn't changed, but I had. As we neared the edge of the forest, something in the air shifted again. Not danger, not warning, just distance. Thorn stopped walking. So did I. The other two fell back, waiting behind. He turned to me, reached out, and with surprising gentleness placed his hand against my shoulder. He looked at me for a long time, and I felt something pass between us. Not thoughts, not even feeling. Just truth. He didn't say goodbye. That wasn't the kind of bond one made, but I knew. This was the edge, the place where they ended, and I began again. He let go, and I turned toward the cabin. I didn't ask to look back, but I did, just once. Thorn was still there, standing where the trees began to thicken again, his shoulders square, arms hanging loosely by his sides. The wind had picked up, thin, sharp, but it didn't seem to touch him. He didn't move. Didn't nod. He was part of the forest now. Or maybe he always had been, and I had only just begun to understand it. I turned again toward the cabin, the snow crunching beneath my boots like broken salt, and started the long walk back, but nothing felt like it had before. The path hadn't changed, not really. It still wound between the same boulders and deadfall, through thickets of spruce and narrow creek beds frozen into glass. But every branch felt like it bent differently now. Every shadow curved a little slower. I passed a tree I swore hadn't been there before. Its trunk spiraled, marked by long claw grooves worn smooth by time and weather. Near it, 3 stones had been stacked in a loose triangle, their surfaces scorched at the edges, like they'd been burned from within. I stopped for a moment, the shard still heavy against my chest, and let the silence press against me. It wasn't empty anymore. I was being watched, but not hunted. Just observed, like the woods were memorizing me as I walked through them. Not to threaten, not to claim, just to remember. I moved slower after that, not from exhaustion, but from something more reverent. Each step felt like it deserved to be placed carefully, like I didn't want to disturb whatever had been here long before me. A bird passed overhead, not flying, gliding, its wings perfectly still. Just a black cut against the pale sky. When I reached the clearing near the cabin, the snow was softer, less disturbed. The tracks from before had vanished beneath a fresh dusting, and the entire place felt reset, like the night hadn't happened, like none of it ever had. But the cabin door was still ajar, swinging slightly on its hinges. The wood creaked as it moved, and for a second I half expected to see my father inside, crouched near the stove, lighting a cigarette with one hand and scowling like I'd just made him wait. But the cabin was empty. It smelled of cold and ash, with a faint undercurrent of something less familiar. Moss, maybe, or animal fur warmed briefly by fire. My pack was still on the floor where I'd left it. The poker lay beside the cot, and there on the table were the 2 feathers. The black one, the red-tipped one, arranged now in parallel, placed with intention, as if someone had come inside only to say, "We didn't forget." I picked them up and tucked them carefully into the side pocket of my coat, then closed the door behind me and slid the bolt back into place. The wind had picked up outside. It whistled through the cracks in the logs and slipped beneath the doorframe. But inside, for the first time, I didn't feel small. I sat by the stove and took the shard from beneath my shirt, held it in my palm, and watched it pulse once, faint and green. The warmth from it didn't spread far, but it didn't need to. It stayed with me. Later, after the snow let up, I stepped outside again and walked the edge of the lake. The ice was smooth now, untouched. No prints, no drag marks, no sign that I'd ever been dragged screaming across its edge by something wild. But I knew better. I walked further along the shore and found something else. Carved into the bark of an old birch near the water's edge was a symbol. A spiral, broken in the middle, and sealed with 3 vertical lines. It hadn't been there before. I reached out and touched it. The bark was dry, but the cut edges were still fresh, the sap just beginning to freeze. Behind me, the woods gave a low creak, a sound like weight shifting in the trees. I didn't turn around. Instead, I took off the shard and held it against the symbol. The lines lined up almost perfectly. Something buzzed beneath my skin. Not pain, but memory. A low hum that sat in my stomach and spread up to my throat. Then it was gone. When I walked back toward the cabin, the sun had begun to dip, casting everything in a dull amber that painted the trees in long shadows. I passed by the porch and froze. Just beside the steps, pressed into the snow, was a handprint. Not a boot print, not a claw. A hand. Larger than mine by 3 times, the fingers long, splayed, each tip ending in a dull crescent groove. No matching print beside it, just that one, like someone had crouched there, placed it down for balance and watched. I didn't feel afraid. I stepped around it without disturbing the edges and sat on the top stair. I didn't know what time it was. I didn't care. I sat there until the last of the light bled out of the sky and the trees faded into silhouette. I waited for something. A sound. A voice. Another visitor. But nothing came. Not that night. But they had been there. I knew it, and not just in body. Something else had settled. Inside the woods. Inside me. Inside that cabin with its crooked walls and cold stove and broken cot. I didn't know what came next. I just knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The sound of the truck reached me before the engine came into view. It rolled slow down the gravel path, like it didn't quite belong to the land anymore. Tires skimming ice patches with careless weight. I watched it from the doorway, one hand resting on the frame, the other pressed flat over the stone shard beneath my shirt. I didn't feel anything at first. No rush of relief, no anger, not even confusion. Just stillness, like I'd stepped too far outside the old world to ever really return to it. Then the door swung open and he stepped out like nothing had happened. Like days hadn't passed. Like I hadn't been left to starve and freeze and crawl through a darkness he'd never believe. Dean Harper slammed the truck door and stretched his arms, like I'd just come back from a gas station, like all of this had been part of a plan. He looked at me and frowned. Not in worry, but in irritation. Like I was the one who'd done something wrong by still being there. "Damn roads iced over," he muttered. "I had to wait it out in town." He didn't ask if I'd eaten. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't look at the scratches along my arms, or the bruise blooming yellow just beneath my jaw. He didn't look at me at all. Not really. He walked past me into the cabin, tracking snow across the floor. "You didn't keep the stove lid," he said. "Smells like a damn freezer in here." I didn't answer. I just watched him. Watched how small he looked inside that space now. How the air didn't seem to wrap around him like it did the others. He opened a cabinet, pulled out a thermos I hadn't touched, and poured something into a tin cup. The liquid sloshed with the sound of bourbon. He sipped, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and glanced at me sideways. "You're awful quiet. I thought you weren't coming back." My voice came out calm. Too calm. Even I heard it. He shrugged. "You're still alive. Cabin's fine. Wasn't that bad, was it?" He laughed, but it died halfway in his throat. Something about the silence must have gotten to him. Maybe for the first time, he noticed it didn't feel like he was alone with a kid anymore. Maybe he realized it felt like he wasn't alone at all. Later that day, a man came up the road in a beat-up Chevy. I recognized him before he even stepped out. Mr. Langston, the property manager who leased the land out for seasonal hunting. He looked surprised to see me, even more surprised when I opened the door myself and stood there blocking it. "Your dad didn't mention you were out here with him," he said after a moment. Thought he was solo. His eyes flicked behind me, toward the wood stove. "You all right?" I didn't know how to answer that, so I said, "I'm not staying." He paused, squinting. "You've got somewhere else to go." "No," I said. "But I'm still not staying." He gave me a long look, then nodded slowly. "I've got a place in town. Warm. Quiet. You ever need it, you ask." And he handed me something. Not a key, a photograph, faded, torn at the edge. In it, 3 figures stood just inside the tree line, blurred, tall, too wide in the shoulders to be hunters, too still to be men. "Took this near Ridge Hollow. Follow 76, he said, tapping the corner. "Some things don't leave these woods." Some of them remember. Dean took the photo from my hand the moment I closed the door and laughed, loud and hollow. Jesus, people believe anything. "This is what he is showing kids now?" He crumpled it and tossed it into the stove. "Let me catch you starting in with that monster crap and we're done." But the picture didn't burn right away. It sat on the coals, curling slow, the image bleeding to black like it wasn't ready to go. That night I didn't sleep. I sat outside on the steps, the wind brushing across my face, stars peeking through cracks in the clouds. I watched the trees. I didn't expect them to move. I just wanted them to know I was still watching too. The next morning, the phone rang at the general store where Dean stopped for smokes and another bottle. He came out pale, lips thin. "It's your mom," he said. "She didn't wake up." I don't remember crying. I remember standing still, while everything around me felt like it wanted to fall. Dean put a hand on my shoulder, and I stepped away from it. He didn't reach again. Back at the cabin, He poured a drink and sat without saying a word. I packed my things. The feathers. The shard. The clothes I hadn't outgrown yet. When he saw me at the door, he looked tired. Not older. Just emptied out. Not older, right? I'd rather that, I told him, than here. He didn't stop me. He didn't fight. He just nodded once, slow, like maybe he understood a part of it, even if he'd never say it out loud. I walked out past the truck, past the last set of tire marks, past the place where I'd first seen them. I didn't turn around, but I did feel it, faint, like a hand pressed through the trees behind me. Not pulling me back, not begging me to stay, just with me. And somewhere deep in the woods, farther than I could see, the snow shifted, not heavy. Just enough to let me know the forest still remembered my name. I never went back to the system after that. Not really. They processed me through it, gave me a case number, shuffled me between towns. But wherever they placed me, I stayed quiet. Not the kind of quiet that makes teachers concerned. The kind that makes them forget your name after attendance. I learned to shrink myself into corners, to sleep light and walk softer, to keep my memories where no one could ask about them. Not because I was afraid of being disbelieved, but because I knew there wasn't a word for what I carried. There still isn't. The shard stayed with me. Not around my neck anymore. Too risky. But wrapped in cloth, tucked in the lining of whatever bag I was allowed to keep. It stopped glowing after a while. Or maybe I just stopped needing it to. Sometimes I take it out and hold it for no reason, just to feel the curve of it in my palm, the faint trace of something humming under the surface. It was never warm again. Not really. But it never cooled either. That stone remembered, even when I tried not to. Years passed the way winter creeps over windows. Slow, unnoticed, until everything outside feels far away. I was 15 when I stopped writing my last name on forms. 17 when I dropped out and started working under tables. 19 when I left the coast and headed north again, chasing something I hadn't dared name since I was 9. I told people I liked the cold, said the heat made me sick. But the truth was simpler. I was looking for trees that whispered. It took me until 24 to find my way back to Sand Ridge. Not the exact road, not the same cabin. That was gone. Torn down or rotted through. But the land still remembered me. I could feel it in my spine the moment I stepped out of the truck. The pines leaned the same way. The light hit the lake with that same heavy stillness. It was winter again. Snow higher than my boots. No footprints, no sound, but I knew I was close. I didn't bring much. Just a small pack, the old feathers still pressed between journal pages I didn't let anyone read. And the shard. It hadn't changed, still smooth, still pale green in certain light. I walked the edge of the lake until the trees thickened, then stepped off the trail and let my body take me. Not my memory. Something deeper. My feet moved without thinking, and the woods opened without resistance. There wasn't a path. There never had been. But I knew exactly where I was going. And when I found it, I almost didn't believe it. Not because it wasn't real, but because it hadn't aged. The hollow tree was still there, blackened, splitting upward into the sky like a mouth frozen mid-breath. The burn marks around the entrance hadn't spread. The moss still clung to its roots. And at its base, half buried in snow, was the same ring of stones. 3, placed with care. Undisturbed, I knelt there, not to pray, just to listen. The silence came first. Then the pressure, like a weight behind my ribs that hadn't been there before, and suddenly had never left. I closed my eyes and waited, and in that waiting, I remembered things I didn't know I'd forgotten. The way Thorn had moved between trees like wind-given bones. The way Branna's eyes never blinked, but never felt unkind. The way Oren's hand had lingered just above my shoulder the last time I saw him, as if he knew he wouldn't touch me again but needed to be close. I opened my eyes and looked down. There was something new now. nestled between the stones. A loop of woven bark, tightened around a single bone. Small, bleached. The kind that might have once fit inside a wrist or a palm. It didn't frighten me. It didn't feel like death. It felt like an answer. I didn't take it. I didn't touch it. I just stood and turned back toward the lake. I left everything the way I found it. Some places aren't meant to be claimed. When I reached the clearing, the sun was low, bleeding orange through the branches. I crossed toward where the old cabin had been. Just stumps now. A few broken boards curled in frost. But something waited in the center, not large, just enough. A can, rusted, familiar, Dr. Pepper. I stared at it for a long time before picking it up. The label was faded, but the shape was the same. It hadn't been there when I arrived. I would have seen it. That much I knew. I set it down gently and sat beside it, the snow crunching under my weight. I looked at the trees. They didn't move, but I could feel them breathing, and then, faint, somewhere behind me. Too far to be seen, but too close to be doubted. A single knock. Not against wood. Not against stone. Just a rhythm. 3 soft pulses carried on wind that didn't exist. And in that moment, I smiled, because I knew I wasn't being warned. I was being welcomed. There are stories that slip through the cracks of what we call real. Stories whispered between pine needles, buried beneath snowfall, passed from breath to breath without ever needing a name. Some of them never reach the light. Others walk beside us in silence, shaping who we become without asking permission. And then there are the ones that choose to be remembered. Not for glory, not for proof, but because something in them belongs to all of us. This story was never about fear. It was about the quiet moments between it, the kind where survival doesn't look like running. It looks like listening. It looks like staying still long enough to feel what's watching you isn't always there to hurt you. Sometimes it's there to remind you that not all things in the dark are trying to take something. Some of them are trying to give something back. There's a kind of kindness that doesn't wear a face we're used to. It doesn't come wrapped in warm voices or gentle hands. Sometimes it arrives with a sound we don't understand. A shape we weren't taught to trust. It doesn't speak our language, but it speaks anyway. In safety offered, in violence stopped, in the space created around a child who was never seen until something older decided he should be. And maybe that's what this has always been about. Not monsters, not legends, not even wilderness, but the simple, aching truth that we are not alone. Not even when we think we are. That compassion, in its truest form, doesn't need permission to cross boundaries. It doesn't need shared blood or shared language. It only needs someone to recognize the moment it arrives. Because sometimes, the most powerful connection doesn't come from those who look like us. It comes from those who see us, who protect what no one else would bother to keep safe, who show us, without ever needing to explain, that family doesn't always start with the people who raise you, or the ones who gave you their name. Sometimes, it starts the moment you realize you were worth saving. If you've ever felt forgotten, if you've ever stood on the edge of something bigger than you and wondered whether you mattered to it at all, remember this. The forest remembers. The ones who dwell in its shadows are not always waiting to harm. Some are waiting to love, in the only way they know how. Thank you for sitting with this story, for listening with more than your ears, for making space in your heart for what lies beyond reason, beyond comfort, and sometimes beyond belief. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you of anything you've lost, or helped you see something you've carried all along, I'd be honored to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to walk with us again through stories like this, where the strange meets the deeply human, I invite you to subscribe and stay close. We've still got so many woods to walk through together, and who knows what might be waiting in the quiet.